If you're feeling the cost of living sting, then there's a good chance you've rolled back your ambitions for your next brand new car. Maybe you've looked at some of Australia's most affordable options, and this little car here is one of them. It's the new Kia Picanto. It's one of the few cars left under $20,000, and it's one of the few cars left where you can get it with a manual transmission. But being cheap is one thing, and being good value is quite another. So what does the 2024 Kia Picanto have to offer? Let's take a look. Let's talk a little more about that price tag, because there are now only a handful of vehicles on sale in Australia which can be had brand new for under $20,000, and this is one of them. The Picanto starts from a bargain $17,890 before on-roads for the base manual sport, but the GT line one we have for this review is nearly $2,000 pricier at $19,690. The automatic transmission option costs a further $1,600. At the time we shot this video, second-hand car prices were still very inflated, so the idea of buying a small car like this brand new with a 7-year warranty is more appealing than ever. Now, in my time at CarsGuide, I've reviewed the Picanto several times, and for this update, it feels like maybe the least has changed. But considering its small size, the Picanto has always packed great value. New for this year is a sporty exterior redesign, standard synthetic leather trims for the wheel and shifter, the analog dials have been dumped in favour of a digital instrument cluster, electric folding wing mirrors, and a surprisingly thorough array of active safety items, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Meanwhile, splashing a little extra for this GT line version nets you a flat bottom steering wheel, USB-C ports in the cabin, 16-inch alloy wheels with new designs, and an even more aggressive body kit. The Picanto also has the advantage of being the only survivor in this small car segment. It has outlived most of its rivals, with only the outgoing MG3 really competing on price, and even then, a new generation MG3 is due shortly, but it's set to be more expensive. Soon the Picanto may be the only city car left in Australia. There are a variety of factors for why city cars like this are going out of fashion. These days, buyers orient towards larger vehicles, and small cars like this are increasingly difficult to comply to the coveted maximum 5 ANCAP stars. But I think it's a shame, because this segment is really starting to shine internationally with some really cool designs. Overseas, cars like the Nissan Sakura, Honda N1 and Hyundai Casper, and a long list of others are so fetching, and the Kia Picanto is another example of a cool looking piece of kit. Particularly in this GT line form, the new Picanto has adopted more of the science fiction-y sort of design language from the rest of Kia's increasingly electric range. You've got these aggressive light fittings, you've got these cool little wheel designs, and you've got overall a more squared off kind of vibe, but less has changed when it comes to the interior. It is a little disappointing to see how little has changed in this cabin for the MY24 upgrade. I do like the flat bottom steering wheel that's specific to the GT line. I don't mind the little digital dash cluster in here, and the multimedia touchscreen is a great example of like headline tech in a really affordable small car like this. You also get shortcut buttons for everything on the steering wheel and on that multimedia unit itself, which is rare to see these days, and I really appreciate. It is just a little bit of a shame that there's not more of the more up-to-date hardware that you get across the rest of Kia's range, like in the new Sportage or its new EVs. Another drawback is the abundance of hard plastics in here, like Kias of old. There's hard plastics across the top of the dash, there's hard plastics here, there's hard plastics even in this elbow rest. Even though it has like a synthetic leather finish over the top of it, there's no padding, it's just a hard plastic below, so you do get a fatigue when you drive this car on longer trips and your elbow just sits on like a hard surface. It's a bit of a shame. But there are other areas where the practicality is really well served. You get huge bottle holders in the doors, plenty for our CarsGuide bottle here, and a further two with these nifty little flip out finishes for this console area down here, so you can actually store quite large objects in there, which is a nice touch, or you can flip out the little cup holders and put your cup in there. There's also a little space for a small cup under the handbrake, which is useful to have, better than it just being covered over with plastic, I suppose, and a cute little tiny little armrest console box there as well. Okay, backseat of the Picanto. I bet you were thinking it would be worse than it actually is. This is behind my own driving position. I'm 182 centimeters tall, and as you can see, I've got just enough room for my knees, but it is nice that there's soft claddings on the backs of these front seats, so if your knees were hard up against it, at least it won't be uncomfortable. I've also got a notable amount of headroom, just like I do in the front seats. That's really nice to see, and these nice soft seat claddings continue as well. One thing that doesn't continue, well, Kia's dropped the pretense with the soft leather-esque finishes in the doors. It's just hard plastic back here. And there's also no bottle holders to speak of at all. There's not really any storage. There's a pocket on the back of the passenger seat, but that's it really. There's not a drop-down armrest or anything like that. In the back of this one, there's a USB-C port, just a single one, but no adjustable air vents.
Boot space is pretty tiny at 255 litres, and this may rule the Picanto out for some family buyers. It was large enough to fit only the big CarsGuide travel case with very little room to spare. Somehow there's still enough room under the floor for a space-saver spare wheel though.
Under the bonnet here is another area where the Picanto could use a little bit of innovation. It's got the same carryover 1.2 litre 4-cylinder engine as before. See the power figures on your screen now. They don't look like much, but this is a light little car, so it does suit it quite well. The front wheels are driven via either a 4-speed automatic or, in this case, a 5-speed manual.
It's a shame that the more modern 3-cylinder turbo from the previous GT variant is seemingly not making a comeback this time around.
So it's a cheap and cheerful little car, but is it a cheap and cheerful drive experience? Well, it's a little old world in a lot of ways, because you've got a kind of tiny little engine and you've got a very kind of rudimentary manual transmission in here. So you do really need to drive this car. There's a sort of a bit going on when it comes to concentrating. It's not today's modern automatics. But I do like that it's a manual because firstly, it keeps the skill of driving one alive, and secondly, you can really make the most of this little car because the 4-speed automatic transmission, which is the only other option, well, it isn't particularly good. Yes, it's a lot easier to drive, but I find this car's much more engaging when you're changing gears yourself. In fact, I'd go so far as to say the Picanto is actually quite a bit of fun in this form. Yes, it's not particularly fast, and yes, this manual transmission isn't the best on the market, because the thing is, usually these days when you drive a manual, it ends up being a performance manual that's like nicely damped and really clicky, and a lot of thought has gone into the ratios, but this one is just straight up rudimentary. It's very mechanical, and again, requires that concentration to drive. It's very engaging. Now, there are other areas worth thinking about when it comes to the Picanto. Number one is this GT line in particular rides pretty firm. It's got big wheels and the suspension is quite stiff and it doesn't travel much, and this car's quite light, so it's got a firm, kind of bouncy nature, but also because it is so firm, it's quite noisy on coarser chip surfaces and up at freeway speeds as well. So you do end up with a car that's quite true to its nature. It's a car that's best placed around city streets and not really up at those higher speeds. It's not to say it can't go on freeways, it's much better suited to around town. The steering's also quite nice, it's quite firm, it lets you feel this car quite a bit in the corners, so it's not a kind of lifeless, over-assisted steering feel that some Korean cars have these days. And that's maybe one of the good things about having a car which is so simple. It is quite a joy to drive. And while we're on the topic of it being so well suited to driving around town, it is an absolute joy to park, it's an absolute joy to dart around city streets in, because it doesn't feel like a lot of cars feel these days, big and heavy and overburdened, and like they're not really suited to streets like we have where I'm testing the car in Sydney. So, who will the Picanto suit? Well, I think it'll suit quite a few people who live in cities, because it is such a little car, easy to live with, easy to drive, but also I think it might suit some people who actually still enjoy the art of driving, who still maybe want to learn how to drive a manual, or they know how to drive a manual and they can't find a car on the market right now that kind of does what this car does and forces you to think about driving. I think there's really something that this car offers that so few other cars on the market offer right now. So yes, Picanto, I think it's fun to drive, I think it's a unique little offering, and I think while it's a little old school, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, so little engine, manual transmission, does it actually save you much fuel? Well, I've driven this car quite a bit this week in conditions that I would consider to be truly mixed. So it's seen a bit of freeway, it's seen quite a bit of suburban driving, and I've been milling the little manual along, and I've produced a fuel figure of 6.2 litres to 100 Ks. Now, see how that compares to the official number on your screen now, but for a bit of context, you can save fuel these days by swapping over to a hybrid if you can get one, because a Corolla can do even less fuel consumption than this, despite how small and light this car is. And I think that shows you a lot about where the market's going. You can't just get away with having a downsized car and a downsized engine. You really do need to have a little bit of electrification at play if you want to save yourself big time on those fuel bills. The other thing that's impressed me quite a bit about the drive experience for the little Picanto here is, despite the fact that it's got all of the safety systems, like way more safety systems than you'd expect, make sure to read the full review over at carsguide.com.au to see the list, but they're also not too invasive. Like, normally a lot of Korean cars have all these great safety systems, but they're a little bit too much, especially things like lane keep assist. But in the Picanto, not so much. It's pretty straightforward to drive, and it doesn't have safety systems which really interfere with that drive experience constantly.
The current gen Picanto doesn't have an ANCAP safety rating, and on the face of it, it would be pretty tough for it to get the full 5 stars under the current regime.
Now, like with all Kias, the ownership promise is a really big deal. It's a big part of the value offering, because you get 7 years of warranty on a car that costs less than 20 grand, but you also get 7 years of roadside assist and a 7-year cap price service program. Now, if you want to see the full details on the servicing, make sure to check out the full review at carsguide.com.au. But what I will say is it's not as cheap as you might expect. For example, it's not as cheap as a lot of Toyotas. So that's worth factoring in when you're doing your sums. Australians are buying bigger and bigger cars when really we should be moving in the other direction, and Kia should be applauded for remaining in this small city car segment and showing people what value is on offer here. While there ultimately are only a handful of changes this time around, and the Picanto is creeping up in price from where it was before, I still think this little city car is worth a look for those whose lifestyle it will suit. Of course, if you want to read more about the full Picanto range, check out our full written review over at carsguide.com.au.